Thank you so much for coming to the talk at 8. I was a little bit concerned that I'll only have like 2 people here. So I appreciate that there's many people here. So I thank you for coming. Thank you for waking up early and coming to this talk. Hey, everyone. My name is Dalia. I am a product manager on the Visual Studio team. And today I'm here to talk to you about lessons learned building AI features in Visual Studio. Before I get started, I was kind of curious about the folks that are here. So I wanted to ask, has anyone tried building a prototype or doing anything with AI within their application? All right, a couple people. Anyone try where it's actually successful in shipping it? Wow, no hands. Okay, so my intention here is to tell you all the things that we ran into while trying to ship an AI product. It's a different beast, and hopefully by me sharing some of these lessons, it'll make it a little bit easier for you and your application. So I'm gonna start by telling you a little bit about me. I am a product manager on the Visual Studio team. Previously, I was a software engineering developer lead on modernization tooling, and I was also a backend developer. And I've also been a developer advocate. I've had different roles, but if you ask me at the very core, what are you, Dalia? I'll tell you I'm a software engineer. I love to build software, and I love to have the computer do something that it couldn't do before. That's at the core who I am. So when this AI thing started really coming up heavily last year, I was looking at it and thinking, well, that's cool. Like there's like this AI thing, ChatGPT tried it a couple of times. I thought it was really cool, but I didn't think it concerned me because I'm a software engineer. I'm not a data scientist. There's AI experts out there. Let's let them worry about AI. But all of that changed. And if I had to pinpoint the moment in time that changed for me, it was May 23rd, 2023. I was sitting at Microsoft Build, attending a conference just like this one. And Kevin Scott came on and talked about the era of co-pilots. And at that point, I heard copilot, didn't really have a full understanding of what that is. And he said, this is why I wanted you to move closer because the text is really small. Apologize about that, but I will spell it out. AI is an application using modern AI to assist you with complex cognitive tasks. So at its core, it is an application, and it's meant to help you with really complex tasks. And one of those complex tasks is programming. So as a Visual Studio product manager, I was thinking, well, it would be nice if I can use AI to help my developers out, my users out. And then later on, he brought on Greg Progman from OpenAI, and he said something that really struck me. He said that, you know, OpenAI is doing all this really great work in the AI space and all this great innovation, but what they can't really do at scale is figure out how do you apply AI in a way that's actually helpful across different domains. So maybe I'm not an expert in, you know, data science or whatever it is, but I am an expert in my users. I'm an expert in developer tools. I'm an expert in Visual Studio. I'm an expert in my audience, what my users are trying to do. So it's up to me to figure out, is there some way I can bring AI to Visual Studio or my own application and make it useful for my developer? So the problem here is that I did not have any AI skills at that point, but I had all the passion in the world. But 6 months later, I was standing in that same conference announcing our first shipped AI feature. This is a big feat, especially starting, you know, I asked how many people have actually shipped an AI feature. I wouldn't have imagined that we would be able to, but not only that, but we've been used by over 40,000 people to help them with their applications. And I'll talk about this feature really heavily throughout the presentation. I'm gonna use it as a use case so you can understand a little bit more about what practically this looks like in an application. I've also built other features since then, but today I'm going to really focus on rename suggestions, and I'm going to share with you all the lessons I learned. It's been a really long journey, but I tried to make it as concise as possible for you. Okay, so first lesson, learn how AI works. It's okay to think AI is magic. If you're just using ChatGPT or your mom, you're my mom, she thinks like, I ask a question, it does a really good job. However, if you're a software engineer and you're trying to use it as a tool, it's really important to understand how this tool works so that you can exploit it to its full potential. And let's talk a little bit about what that means. So when we say AI is a very general term and it encompasses a lot of things. The basic definition is that you're trying to simulate the human brain in a machine. It's been, AI has been around since 1950s, and folks have done lots of research in that area. There's a set of AI called machine learning. That's where you take a machine and you feed a lot of data, and you want it to understand what you're trying to do without explicitly programming it. You don't have to say if else, if else, if else anymore. You're feeding it a lot of data and you're teaching it. You're teaching it based on the data that you're providing it. A technique for machine learning is deep learning, and a generative AI uses deep learning so that you can simulate neural networks to get this generative nature of AI, where you're feeding it a lot of data across the internet and you're telling it, hey, this is what text looks like, and it's going to generate whether it's text, images, so on and so forth. I like to use examples, so let me show you an example. Let's say you see this sentence. It says, I'm a bit jet lagged. It was an 8-hour. How would you finish this sentence? Layover? Flight? Any other guesses? Trip? Flight? Okay. So imagine the models have scoured the internet, looked at all the text in the internet, and is trying to come up with what is the probability that this sentence is going to finish in one of these words. Flight, trip, ride, journey, mission. This is basically what a generative AI model is doing. It's trying to predict the next token. The token, you don't have to think of it as a word. Token is not equal a word, but it's basically predicting, okay, what's the next token based on statistical probability. I've seen the sentence many, many times. It's probably flight, but it could be trip, it could be ride, it could be journey, it could be mission. That's why whenever someone is like, oh, I tried ChatGPT and sometimes it's returning this and sometimes it's returning that, I'm like, that's built into the technology. It needs to do that. It's giving you a probable answer. It's not giving you a deterministic answer. So let's talk about strength. What is this tool good at? That's what you're going to need to understand for your application. What can I use this for exactly? What is it useful for? So one of the first strengths is generating content. Based on what you have so far, it can predict what a next set of tokens are. In Visual Studio, for example, we're using this strength in GitHub Copilot. If you're typing a class and I just said, hey, I have a namespace, rock, paper, scissors, I have a game, it's probably seen rock, paper, scissors many, many times on the internet, so it can try to finish that class for me. That's why it does really well with boilerplate code, because it's seen boilerplate code many, many times. Generated content. The other thing is having conversations. That's why you're seeing a lot of people building chatbots and assistants, because it's really good at that. So you'll see that with GitHub Copilot Chat. We're using that strength to implement that. So if your app can really use a chatbot, sometimes it doesn't, by the way. Like, not every app needs a chatbot. But in your case, if your application needs a chatbot, an generative AI model can really help with that. The other thing that it's really good at is summarizing content. It takes a lot of content, lots of content, and it summarizes it into a few words. One great example of that is generate commit message feature in Visual Studio. What it's doing is it's looking at the changes you made to your file, looking at that diff, and it's summarizing into a few words. So if you have some kind of problem in your application where it would really be helpful to look at a lot of data and summarizing it, I found that it does a really good job with that. it does a good job. Like, good is relative because, you know, we've seen the how many fingers and all those things that it generates, but it does a decent job creating images and videos, doing language translations, personalization, data augmentation, and there's a bunch of strengths that we probably haven't even discovered yet. But let's talk about weaknesses, because this is just a tool. Sometimes it's good for some things and it's bad for other things. So it's important to understand what are the current weaknesses so that when you're building it into your application, you're accounting for those weaknesses. There's, I'm not going to go into all the weaknesses, but there's 4 main ones that I want to highlight here. First, context. Models are not very good at understanding context without a user providing a lot of context about, like, hey, what are you trying to do here? What's your role? Or what kind of data should I be looking at? Or like when you ask a generic short question, it's like, I don't know what to do with this. And on the other end, if you give it too much context, it doesn't know what to look at and it gets confused. So that's one thing that you want to keep in mind when you're building your applications, is how much context is just enough context to make it helpful. Accuracy. We've seen a lot of stuff about, you know, hallucination, or they call it fabrication now. Like I showed you, it's a sentence and it's trying to be statistically probable prediction there. So sometimes it sounds plausible, the answer sounds plausible, but it really isn't. So how do you provide it enough context and enough data so that it's more accurate? And bias. It's trained on a lot of data that is not necessarily, it's full of bias. So it can perpetuate some of these biases. So what are you going to do to mitigate against that? And complex problem solving. This is something that we're working on. Like, how do we get it to do even more complex tasks, more, and how do we push it to that edge? That's why I said current, because we're trying really hard to figure out, can we have it do more, especially with agents, for example. The sweet spot, if you're trying to figure out where AI fits within your application, is to look at some of the generative AI strengths that I highlighted and others, and figure out what is your application's users need. Because I don't know who you're serving, but you're an expert in the people you're serving. What problems do they have? And can you revisit any of the problems that they have and solve it in a way that you've never been able to solve it before? So let's move on to lesson number 2, which ties really heavily to this. How many times have you seen an application or a feature and you wondered, why the heck did they build that? This is a really common thing, and I have engineers telling me, Dalia, we're just sprinkling AI all over the place. Well, if you look at AI as something that you're just going to add to your application without actually solving a problem, this is what we end up with. So I always tell folks, start with a user need. You probably have hundreds and hundreds of like feedback tickets or customer interviews, or like, we don't have a shortage of problems that we can solve. So find an actual problem and then see if AI can help you solve that problem. Here's how we've done it I ended up doing in Visual Studio. So let's think about fundamentals. What is our mission from a Visual Studio perspective? Well, we need to empower every developer to do more. So they need to be able to write their code better. They need to be able to debug better. They need to be able to ship faster. That's our job. So my question was, okay, but what is stopping them right now from doing more? And I really wished I could get a bunch of Visual Studio users in one room and just have them go off and tell me all the problems that they've had. Well, luckily, I have access to Visual Studio users right in the Visual Studio group, because the Visual Studio team uses Visual Studio to build Visual Studio. So they're one of our customers. So I sat them all down and I said, okay, tell me your least favorite part of your job. And he said, what do you mean? There's a lot of stuff I hate about my job. I said, no, let's just have a venting session. Let's just tell me all the problems. You know, when you get into a room with software engineers, they jump right into solutions. I tell them, no, I want all your problems. And the ideas started flowing. They were like, oh, I hate reading other people's code, especially if they don't know how to write it very well. Oh, you know, I don't want to touch legacy code because there's no test coverage, and I'm worried to touch it at all and introduce a regression. I'm worried about this, I'm worried about that. Just problems left and right, and fundamental problems. These are not new problems. This is problems we've had for many, many years. But the question is, can we make a difference? Can we make a dent and actually help folks do this a little bit better? So we went through and we talked about problem after problem after problem after problem. And then we ran into this problem. Which problem do we want to go after first? And this is something I caution a lot of teams against. The number of times that we've hit analysis paralysis where the team just sits around for months not deciding on the perfect application or the perfect feature or the perfect blah, and then they spend months making a decision when they could have just decided something, built something, and then changed their minds. So be careful when you're brainstorming or if you're sitting down and you're trying to find a good user need to fulfill to get stuck on that step. So luckily, actually, that's where lesson number 3 comes in. Build something, anything. Don't just sit there, I really want to emphasize this. Instead of sitting around trying to pick the perfect feature to deliver to your customer, build something, try it out, and see how it works. Luckily, we had a hackathon 2 weeks after that session that I attended. So I rallied the team and I was like, hey, could you please participate with me with this hackathon? Let's just build something. So we built this thing called CodeShine. I came up with the name. I was pretty proud of it, but we couldn't actually do anything with it after the fact, and I'll tell you why. But here's what CodeShine did. So we have a button here in Lightbulb. It says CodeShine with Copilot. It'll take your method and it'll make it a lot more concise. It'll clean it up. It'll produce some docs for you, and it will change your method names to better method names and better variable names. And it'll give you a summary of the changes it made, including changes that impacts the code at the top, so you can pay attention to that, and changes that, all the other changes it made. And that was our hackathon project that we did in 2 weeks. And we learned a lot. There was a lot of things that we learned from this hackathon. First, actually getting something set up. You know, how many times you have like a tool that you want to get around to it and you want to get around to setting it up but never do? Yeah. That, for me, that was GitHub Copilot. I was like, oh, someday I'll install it on Visual Studio and actually try it. That actually forced me. The hackathon forced me. The really big thing that we learned throughout this is prompt engineering. Prompt engineering is really, really important in this space. Understanding how you're going to interact with, how you're going to talk to the model and get it to do what you need it to do. And I'll talk about prompt engineering more later. But prompt engineering was really big lessons for me for this hackathon. What are some of the APIs that are available? Like, how do I talk to the model from my application, so on and so forth? What are some of the APIs that are available? And the strengths and weaknesses. I can tell you all the strengths that I want, but unless you're sitting there building something and seeing what works and what doesn't, it doesn't really hit you until then. Including limitations. What does it mean to have a token limit? Well, when you're sitting there trying to send a request to the model and you hit an error that says, oh, you've reached a token limit, that's when it really hits you what it means to have a token limit. And of course, lots and lots of pleasant troubleshooting. Best reason to prototype is to have something to actually show your users and make sure that you're building something that they would want or need. So if nothing else, if for no other reasons, you know, learning, blah, 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 all the stuff, it gave us something to show users and see if we're even anywhere close on the right track. That's where this lesson comes in. Don't get attached to your prototype and be ready to pivot and iterate on it. we had a lot of red flags. So we showed GoatShine to a bunch of users during something we call quick pulses. Quick pulses are interviews that we have with customers where we bring them in, we show them like a design and a concept, and then ask them, hey, what do you think? Would you use this? So on and so forth. So many red flags. So let me show you some of them. One of the big ones is one user saw GoatShine and said, oh, that looks really good. I'm just going to accept it. And I kind of freaked out for a moment because I'm like, oh, they think that this is like great and they didn't even review it. They thought it was like, it made it way too easy for people to accept this coding suggestion. And later I realized it's because we put it in Lightbulb. And when you're using Lightbulb in Visual Studio, you're assuming that whatever thing is coming up or whatever fix is coming up is deterministic. Like, it's coming from the compiler, it's coming from whatever it is, and you know that it's right. Well, then that means that my entry point is not correct. It does not fit into the system, and it might cause a lot of damage if it's wrong. There's a bunch of other flags, but one of my favorite one was one user looked at the summary and he said, I'm not reading that. Like, that's fair. I wouldn't read that either. So we're like, okay, this is not great. However, there was some green flags. One big green flag is a user looked at the code and he said, it looks like it inferred the variable name and the parameter and the method name somehow. And I don't know how, but this is pretty cool. And so we took that and we built rename suggestions. So let me switch to my Visual Studio because I like to add a little bit of risk to my presentations. Okay, so let's say you are in Visual Studio and you just finished writing your method up, or you're looking at someone else's method and wondering, what are these names? So you right-click on one of the names and you decide, I want to rename it. So we're going to come up, and with this feature, we're going to give you some naming suggestions based on the name that you have. Now, what I really want to highlight here is, what names did I give it? Did we provide? I said player choice, user choice, and first choice. Traditionally, in software engineering, what I would have to do is I would have to infer what this variable is based on the type, maybe choice. Maybe I'll look at the method name. It's a lot of like if-elses here, and I'll probably not even do a good job having a variable that really describe what this variable is doing. And this is where AI really shines, because I was able to send the model a chunk of code and tell it, hey, interpret this code and give me a summary of what this code is doing. That's basically what a variable is. A variable name is supposed to summarize what this variable is doing. So this is an example of exploiting generative AI in a way that's going to be helpful to your users. So I can pick it, choose it, and rename it. The other case that it does really well in is actually, it does a better job at method names than it does variable names. Why? Because all of the method implementation is right there, and it doesn't have to go around and look around, especially if I rename it down here. So if I right click on this and I say, hey, can you give me some naming suggestions? It's going to tell me, get result message, generate outcome message, determine result message. How did it know that this is a result? It's looking at what this method is doing, summarizing it, and then giving me a suggestion. So that's rename suggestions in Visual Studio. Let me dig in a little bit more about what we're doing under the covers. So let's say a user, let me step back. In your application, let's say you know what you want to do. You want to do a specific thing in your application. Someone invokes a button and you want to do something. I would start by breaking it down into what problem are you trying to solve and what are you trying to do with your application. For me, it was like, okay, when someone clicks rename, what I would like to do is send the model something and then have it give me back some name suggestions. So what I needed to do is I need to talk to the model and tell it exactly what I want. So I'll send it a prompt and say, a software developer is using an AI rename feature in a code editor. Your task is to help a developer improve their symbol, ... I'll tell you more about the prompt later, but I need to tell the model what it needs to do. And then the model, as a result, will return me a response based on my requests. And in this case, it's returning a JSON object that contains the 3 names that I wanted based on my request. How do you do this? I usually suggest starting with simple techniques. Whenever I talk about AI, folks start talking about fine-tuning. And I'm like, hold on a second. You do not need to fine-tune a model. Why are we talking about? Actually, my friend texted me on the way here and said, hey, Dalia, I heard about this AI stuff. Can you help me fine-tune a model? And I was like, I don't think that's what you want to do, but I can help you build whatever you need to build. So let's talk about what techniques are there. The first technique is zero shot, or Brian would call it one shot. Brian did a great job with his sessions on Tuesday on AI. So this is, has anyone gone to his sessions? It's awesome, wasn't it? Awesome. Thank you for being here, Brian. So zero shot is when you send a model a prompt without any examples and you tell it, hey, do something for me. In this case, tell me a joke. You've probably scoured the internet, saw a lot of jokes. Just give me a joke. So we're going to send that to the LLM, and it's going to return me a joke. So that's the most simple, basic thing that you can do with a prompt. Another technique is a few-shot prompting. A few-shot prompting would be you tell it to do something and you give it some examples to guide it. In this case, I tell it, tell me a joke, and I give it 3 jokes that are food-related. So I'm kind of guiding it there. And as a result, what it's going to do is it's going to give me a joke that's also food-related. So think about it this way. For zero shot, let's say you say, write me a hello world in C#. It can do that. But what if you want to, analyze a sentiment of a customer review? Well, it'd be nice to tell it, okay, what kind of sentiments are you looking for? Like positive, negative, neutral, blah, blah, blah. So maybe you tell it, analyze sentiment for this customer review. And here are some examples. And here are some sentiments. Here's another customer review. How would you categorize that? And it does well with that. Another method is retrieval augmented generation. Now, one of the problems with AI models is that they have limited knowledge based on when were they last trained. That's why sometimes when you go to ChatGPT, you're getting an out-of-date answer. The way you can mitigate that is to use retrieval augmented generation. And that's when you go off and you look up some relevant data, and you get that search result, feed it in with your prompt to the model, and then it gives you a result. In this case, for example, I wanted a topical joke. I wanted something that's relevant to today's news, so it gave me an AI-related joke. If you use Bing in Copilot in Bing, for example, you'll notice it's using RAG as well. That's why a lot of times if I'm looking something up that it needs to be like the latest, like what's the latest fine-tuning techniques, I'll go to Copilot in Bing because it's using search results and feeding that to the prompt and then giving me the result. Anytime you're finding yourself looking up stuff that needs to be relevant, that's when RAG is really helpful. And finally, fine-tuning. Fine-tuning is when you take a pre-trained model and then feed it some specialized data and giving it more weights for that specialized data. For example, GitHub Copilot is actually running a fine-tuned model under the covers that's fine-tuned on code specifically. So it writes code really well, does a lot of great work with code, but if you ask it to plan a trip or write you a recipe or whatever it is, it won't do that because it's fine-tuned for code. So, for example, I've discovered that jokes do not travel well within different cultures. So let's say I want the model to give me a joke that's relevant to like where I'm from, which is Egypt. Well, I could tell the model, hey, go give me a joke and in Arabic, it'll still give me an English, a joke that's funny in English, but it's not funny in Arabic. But what if I take my model and I feed it thousands and thousands and thousands of Egyptian jokes? That's when it's actually going to be able to give me a joke that Egyptians would find funny, but you probably wouldn't in the US. Now, I want to say fine-tuning is, again, very specialized. If you're in the medical field, if you're in the legal field, and you're doing a very specialized application of your model that you need, then fine-tuning makes sense. But I feel like a lot of times, like, it's overkill. In my experience, I haven't had to fine-tune a model quite yet. Maybe later, but I've been doing a lot of work with the pre-trained models that are very multi-purpose and they don't need to be fine-tuned. So what's the recommendation here? I would recommend, actually, this was a great recommendation from Mark Rusinovich. He said, start with zero shot. Just send the prompt to the model and ask it for what you need for your application and see if it does it well, consistently. If that doesn't work, then try few shot. Send the prompt to the model, give it some examples, and then see what it returns. I've used few shot a lot. Rename suggestion would be few shot, and it's pretty effective. If you're looking at the data and the context, it's pretty effective. And then use RAG. RAG is a little bit more work because you're going to have to go retrieve the data and figure out which data you need and all that. Maybe your application doesn't need that, but some applications do. Very last is fine-tuning. So I live in between these two, few shot and RAG. In Visual Studio, a lot of the features that are there are based on few shot and RAG. And that brings us to lesson number 6. This is really, really, really important. A good prompt is key. It's really important to spend some time fine-tuning your prompt. Don't fine-tune your model, but fine-tune your prompt, because you need to really figure out how do you talk to the model in a way that will give you the optimal result. So prompt engineering is the practice of designing inputs for generative AI tools that will produce optimal outputs. So you're trying to figure out, hey, I need these naming suggestions in this specific way, and I need you to consistently give me what I need here. So how did we do this? So I want to share with you some of my early attempts. First time that I was doing this, I was like, okay, when someone does a rename, here's what I'm going to send to the model. This is, hope people see it back there. Here's what I did. I said, your task is to help the developer improve the name of the variable. So I was telling it what to do, and I said, I probably need to tell it it's a variable, right? Because a variable is different than a method, than a class. So I said that. And then I said the variable is indicated by, and then I told it what to look at. This is really important when you're sending data to a model. If you send it a whole file or a whole class, it's like, what am I supposed to look at? So you need to tell it, no, pay attention to this thing. This is what you should be paying attention to. And it says, analyze the definition and usage of the variable in the document. I sent it the snippet of code and I told it, hey, pay attention to this line. And I said, return 3 variable names that would be better in this current document. And here are some of the things to keep in mind. Needs to be used, follow the current coding conventions, and follow the language best practices. And I was like, yeah, off we go. This was the output. This output is problematic for many, many reasons. First off, what is this? Like, what format is this? This is a C# block with like a comment, couple of like 3 variables. It did what I asked it to do. Notice that. I asked it to give me 3 variable names, and it gave me 3 variable names with a bunch of comments and what my class is, and so on and so forth. So I can't parse that. So I was like, that's not going to work. The other really big problem that I noticed was that it changed the type from string to choice. And I was like, oh no, we're going to break everyone's code. So that was also a no-go. Well, 50 attempts later, and just get used to this. It's going to be, It's fun. It's fun. I don't wanna scare people away, but I had to try different iterations of it and figure out, okay, what's the iteration that's gonna give me the result I want? And this is what I ended up with. It says a software developer is using an AI rename feature in a code editor. So I told it what role, like what is it doing? It doesn't know anything, so I need to tell it what it's doing. Your task is to help a developer improve, and I said symbol name. The reason why I discovered symbol is fine is because it turns out, even if I don't tell it it's a variable, if it looks at the position of what it is, it already knows that it's a variable or a method or a class. So I've discovered that I don't need to tell it that it's a variable. And then I said, look at name this identifier. And the engineer I was working with, he ended up giving me the opportunity to replace my variable name with this identifier. So I took advantage of that and said, hey, this is the identifier you need to pay attention to instead of that entire line, which is why I was getting, those type changes. And then I gave it the code like before. And then I said, given the information, give me some suggested symbols. Here's another really big thing that I discovered here. It kept, every time I sent stuff to the model, it kept giving me sometimes JSON and sometimes not. I kept saying, like, please give me JSON. Like, I beg you, give me JSON. It just didn't want to give me JSON. And then finally, someone suggested, hey, well, how about you give it an example of what you're expecting? And I was like, that's really smart. We should do that. And that really helped. Once you give it an example of what the return that you're expecting is, it can do a really good job. That's where few-shot prompting comes in. And that was the result. So it finally gave me the JSON object that I wanted. And we've been doing a lot of iterations on this prompt and making it better. Fun fact, I recently showed this to one of our engineers and they said, Dalia, you're actually biasing the model. I said, what do you mean I'm biasing the model? I'm trying really hard not to bias the model. He said, well, you're sending it camel-cased variables. So when it returns variables, it'll return it to you camel-cased. And I didn't realize that. So he said, a better way to do this is to replace a camel case with ... so that it doesn't assume you're expecting camel case. So those are the kind of things that you discover after you try something and try something and try something. So we're making that adjustment and improvement and rolling it out. So my big lesson here is to try different things and write down your attempts. That's how I got that first prompt from the very beginning, is that I had this giant OneNote, and I just dumped a bunch of like, okay, I tried this is the output. I tried this is the output. You're going to become a scientist. So it's actually pretty fun because it's like, you're not used to that in software engineering. You tell them, the computer to do something, it's going to do something. So this is very different, but it's actually fun when it works, when you finally get it to do what you want it to do. I wish I had this when I started prompt engineering with my application. I did not. This is an OpenAI prompt engineering guide that has really great advice on how to prompt. A lot of great tips on there. One of my favorite tips is to ask the model to think or slow down. And I'm like, ooh, that's I think I saw a paper that said if you tell it to breathe, it'll produce a better result, because you're giving it a chance to kind of generate some content. And then based on that content, it gives you better results. So anyways, there's a lot of strategies for prompting. I highly recommend getting those prompting skills better and better as you go. And you don't need to build an app to get your prompt skills better. You can just find any way that you can inject some of these AI tools into your day-to-day flow. It's been really helpful for making me generally productive in a lot of tasks. For example, like brainstorming. I was like, okay, I don't know what to name my project. So a lot of times I'm like, give me some titles or some names for the projects that I did, like CodeShine. For coding, like, okay, can you explain this regex for me? And it will break it down and tell you, hey, this is what this regex is doing, or generate a quick method for me, so on and so forth. It's really good for learning, and it will not judge you. You can ask it whatever questions you want, and it will not judge you. So I use it a lot for learning new concepts. Everyone's talking about agents. What are AI agents? Okay, and then I ask it questions, and it gives me answers. Any creative content creation, or like you're writing an email and you're really angry sometimes, and you write an email, and it's like, okay, take this email, this angry email, make it professional, and send it off to my boss. So it's been very good for that as well. And personal, like I had a trip coming up where my family was visiting, and I did not feel like coming up with an itinerary. So I asked, hey, my family's visiting, can you come up with some activities that are family friendly and give me some ideas? And I did a pretty good job. And not only do you not need to build an application to try your prompting skills, you also don't need to build a UI. So before we built the UI in Visual Studio, I was trying the prompt out outside of the UI and just making sure that I wasn't magicking up some kind of POC that's never going to happen. So you could try your prompt outside of the environment and see if you can get the model to do what you need it to do. So in this case, like there's a Azure Playground or OpenAI Playground where you can put in your prompts and see what the model is going to return and try it here and there. All right, and that brings us to lesson number 7. Really early on, we were given the advice to not spend too much time on our UI for our prototype. And I'm really, really glad we got that advice, because a lot of times when people see a feature for the first time, they fixate over the UI. They're like, the button is this and the button is that. Is it pills? Is it drop down? Blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if we give you bad suggestions. So in my mind, like, it does not matter how nice of a UI. Of course, you don't want a really crappy UI, but it doesn't matter how nice of a UI you have if your suggestions are not good. So I see a lot of people focus on the elements and clicking, blah, blah, blah. Like, no, you need to spend some time making sure the suggestions you're returning are good. Spend some time prompting and adjusting your prompts and adjusting some more. Make sure that the suggestions you're providing actually provide value. Because if the developer sees my 3 naming suggestions and they are trash, they're not going to use my feature again. I love this quote by Taylor Mullen, one of our engineers on Visual Studio Copilot team. He said, data is your superpower, even more so in an AI world. And I found that really true, because a lot of times with these features, it's not very clear what's a good feature. Like, when I gave you those names, you can show them to 10 different developers and they might disagree on, are they good names? Are they bad names? Did they want them to be shorter? Did they want them to be longer? Like, how do you determine that? With a unit test, you can check if, you're getting this, you're going to get that, and you can have asserts and it's deterministic. But because of non-deterministic nature of AI, it's really important to use data. And here's how we do some of this for our feature. So what's a measure that our feature is doing well? For us, our measure is someone looked at our naming suggestions and chose one of them and accepted them. So what we track is the acceptance rate. We still track like how many people are requesting suggestions or turning off the feature, turning on the feature, but really at the core of it, the quality of it is whether or not people are accepting those suggestions into their code. Another big one is error rate. We had a really high error rate when I was having a really hard time getting the model to return me JSON after begging it to. So it's really important to make sure your error rate is low and the model isn't wrong too many times. But the problem with quantitative data is that you don't really know why people are not accepting suggestions. Is it because the string is too long? Is it because it's camel case, they don't like that? Is it too short? So on and so forth. That's why qualitative data is really important. So we have surveys. So I put out the survey for rename suggestions. And one of the sentiments that I found was people were saying, well, I don't really accept any of your naming suggestions because when I go to rename, I know what name I want to give my variable already, which is completely fair. Sometimes you just rename and you know exactly what you want to do. So I was like, okay, well, that's fair. But in other cases, they were like, well, the names weren't really that great. It didn't really look at the context quite right. It wasn't really helpful. And that's when we start working on those prompts and making sure that context is even better. So when you're building your own application, you want to combine qualitative and quantitative data so you can understand how well your feature is doing. We have quick pulses, like I said. You meet with a customer, you show them the application or the feature, and you have them, throw darts at it. And customer interviews as well. And with that, I want to talk about responsible AI. So a lot of folks talk about responsible AI. When I first looked at the principles for Microsoft Responsible AI principles, so it's fairness, reliability and safety, privacy and security, inclusiveness, transparency, and accountability. And all of that made sense to me. Like, okay, that's how I want to build my app. That's how I want to build my feature. But I really didn't know what that meant. Like, okay, what does it mean for a feature to be transparent? So I want to give you some practical examples of what that meant for us. What does it mean to be, for example, transparent? Transparency means that if a user is interacting with AI within your application, you need to be clear that they're interacting with AI. So you want to be transparent that it's an AI and that results may be variable, which is why in Visual Studio, sometimes you'll see these sentences that says AI suggestions may be inaccurate. And the reason we do that is because if you don't give your user warning and they accept a bad suggestion and something breaks, they're going to be very dissatisfied and they're not going to want to use your feature again. It also encourages people to stop and pause and look at the suggestion before they accept it. And at this point, one might ask, okay, at what point is this like better than just not having any suggestions at all? And I say, always remember how much time you're saving the user because you've given them somewhere to start. It's still worth it. It's still worth having the feature, but you still want them to review the suggestion before they accept it. And a lot of this can come with the user experience that you're building within your application. We found in Visual Studio that if you give developers control and you tell them, for example, what are you using to come up with the suggestions, like what files you're looking at or what projects, they know how to use Visual Studio better and the feature better, so they're happier. But if you hide those details from them, they're like, I don't know why it's giving me the wrong answer and I can't even adjust it. They're typically not very happy. So we're adding more and more controls in there so that the developer, if they see that we've used the wrong file, for example, they can replace that with another context and say, no, use that file instead. It's also important to ask for permission when appropriate. So like this is really important in the space of agents. If an AI system is doing something on behalf of a user, you need to tell the user what you're doing before you change the system. This is really important. And always make it easy for people to undo. Like, don't assume that it's just going to be perfect. They're going to accept it. Everything is going to be fine. Make it easy for them to go back. We use a lot of the privacy principles and security principles. The GitHub Copilot Trust Center outlines. I put a link here because it's actually a really great resource for how do we handle data? What data can we look at, and what data can we not look at, and how do we process data, and all those things, and how there's a lot of rules about how do you take customer data and do something useful with it without compromising privacy and security. So we have an extensive review process that the feature went through, and all of the features in Visual Studio goes through before you ship it to the customer. And it uses a lot of the stuff in the Microsoft Responsible AI standard. So I've linked it here in case you want to take a look at it and see how many of those do you want to apply when you're building your application. The other thing is it really emphasizes feature efficacy, which I appreciate, because it's like, don't keep pushing out features that don't work really well. Make sure that you're actually measuring whether or not it's working well or not. Oh boy. And with that, I'll tell you what my lesson number 9 was, which is be careful with COGs. So it turns out AI is kind of expensive. One of my engineers sent me this meme, and I really appreciated it because I was living this constantly. It's a little bit different than what I'm used to in engineering perspective, because usually you don't think about COGs when you're building your application. At least for my previous applications, I didn't. But in this case, you actually need to be thinking about COGs ahead of time. So let me give you an example of what that looked like. So when we first implemented rename suggestions, we had a button where the user would click on the button and it would give you the naming suggestions. And I got a lot of feedback that says, Dalia, why do I need to click on a button? Like, it should just come up with the suggestions. Like, I shouldn't have to do anything. It needs to do that. So we removed the button, and I was really happy about that. And then a week before we were supposed to release it, I got a ping from one of the engineers on the VS Copilot team, and he asked me, Dalia, how many requests are you expecting for this feature? And I said, a lot. I thought I was clever because I put it in rename, and rename is invoked a lot in Visual Studio, so a lot of requests. And he said, that's not going to work. That's a lot of requests. That's going to be really expensive. So we put by the button. So that was disappointing because I kept getting that same feedback. Dalia, why do I need to click on a button? Even worse, people were saying, oh, I didn't know that feature existed. I saw the button, but I didn't know what it did, so I never clicked on it. So I just kind of like internally screamed. But I noticed something. A few months later, the VS Code team came out with the same feature on VS Code, and it didn't have a button. So I went to my engineers and I said, hey, looks like they figured out a way to make this work without a button and figure out their COGs. Can we revisit this topic? And they said, okay, Dalia. So they looked at our numbers, looked at our requests and said, okay, Dalia, you can remove the button. So now there's no button, but it is a toggle button. So people can still turn it off or on, but it will come up automatically. And when we rolled this out, we saw a big jump in requests, which was great from a usage perspective, but from a cost perspective, that was a problem. Well, we decided we're also going to add a little bit of a delay, because remember, I told you the users were saying, when I go to rename a variable, a lot of times I know the name that I want to give the variable. So we added a little bit of a delay in case you're renaming and you already know what you want to name it. It won't come up and it won't make a request to the model. But if you're waiting a little bit, then you'll see the request being made, and then you'll see the naming suggestions. So this is an example of what that might look like for your application. You start out with pipe dreams, and then you scale it down, and then scale it back up, scale it down. My biggest advice here is to consider COGS as early as possible in your process as you can. So when you're building applications, you'll actually notice in Visual Studio that a lot of the Copilot features require you to click a button or do something invocation related. And that's not because we want a bad user experience for you. It's because it's expensive. So we want to make sure that you actually intended on that happening. Here's what we did to estimate some of the COGs. So we looked at, for example, so this is just general advice, take it or leave it, but I'd like to give you a little bit of practical advice. So first, it'd be great to know just an average of what you're expecting the number of requests to be. So in my case, I looked at the average number of times that rename gets invoked, and it was a really high number. And then I looked at the token size per request. And this is where it's really helpful to roll things out internally or have some kind of prototype so you can get an idea of the average number of tokens that you're expecting per request. And then play around with it. Like set a budget for the feature and watch the requests. That's why, I got those pings from the VS Copilot team, because they were looking at the requests and saying, hey, we're on the high side here. We need to bring it down. And now we're looking at maybe deploying with older models, because sometimes older models work fine and they're cheaper. So the ways you can decrease COGs is you can make less requests. So make your application require some kind of button or some kind of something user related to make the requests. Another one is use less tokens. So think about the context you're sending. Before we would send like an entire file, and a lot of times you don't need an entire file to get a good naming suggestion. What if you just send the method or the places where that variable is being used? So you want to think about, you want to provide good context, but not too much context so that you also don't confuse the model. You can also use smaller models or an older version of a model. We found that sometimes using like 3.5 with RAG was better than using 4.0. So, playing around with the different models, figuring out how do you stay within that budget or limit for you, and always measuring success because you want to make sure you're getting that ROI. And this is something to remember, that what's expensive today will not be tomorrow. That's what I discovered with this feature, is that, at what point they told me to remove the button and then what point add the button. They're figuring out more and more ways to make it cheaper. And I suspect it's going to get more and more cheap as we keep figuring out technology. With any technology at the beginning, it's really expensive and then it gets cheaper as we optimize and make it more accessible for more people. So just keep that in mind when you're building your features. And the last lesson that I want to share here is to enjoy the journey. I feel like I, shared a lot of things that didn't go well and a lot of complications and all this stuff. But this was one of the most fulfilling parts of my career, especially as a software engineer. I didn't realize that at one point I could make my application do something it could never do before. So the process of just having access to something that can allow you to solve a user problem in a way that you've never been able to before has been very fulfilling for me. So take time to enjoy the moments and enjoy the journey. This is an example of this. So this was me and Amadeus walking on campus, actually. It was close to here. And he was talking to me about this idea of, hey, wouldn't it be cool if AI can help me, suggest good variable names and good method names? And we were just, having a chat about the idea. And then this is us demoing it to the team after we got it to work. And this is one idea that he had, which I thought was really cute, was having the ability to customize the prompt and tell it, hey, give me some silly names for my variable name. So again, have fun with it. Really enjoy the journey. And when it works, celebrate. And yeah, that's those are the lessons I have for you. And this is a list here. And these are some resources that I wanted to share. This is a great AI for beginners, for folks that are just getting started. They want some kind of curriculum to follow. This is the OpenAI playground and the Azure OpenAI playground that I showed earlier, where you can try different prompts on the playground and see what it's going to produce for you without a lot of work. And then this is the OpenAI Prompt Engineering Guide. And if you want to learn more about the rename suggestions feature that I talked about during this presentation, I'd love for you to try it out and give us feedback and tell us how we're doing on that. And we love feedback on if you found this session helpful or you have something that I can improve on, I'd love to hear it. So please take the session survey. And with that, I want to say thank you and open up for questions. Question, yes.
So I'm real curious to get into augmented generation for more personalized experience versus doing like 2 shots example. What kind of guide would you recommend on getting into that? I know fine tuning is very heavy creating embeddings and all that. So what are kinds of good guides you can use to find examples of doing a more personalized experience with your brand?
Oh, that's a great question. So the question was, if you wanted a more personalized experience with the RAG, where would you go to look for that? A lot of times, my process involves looking at other use cases across and looking at what some of the implementations look out there. I don't know if there's explicitly a guide for that. Brian, do you know? Yeah, I'll have to get back on that one, because from what I've seen, the way that we've implemented is, like, an example of that is looking at MS Learn docs, or looking at some of the blogs, so that we can return better answers in Visual Studio. So it's a very generic looking at just the docs that the company has. But from a personalization standpoint, I haven't seen that quite yet. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's some kind of resource out there that talks about that. Yeah, happy to follow up if you'd like. Other questions? Yes. Oh, great question. So the question is the renaming suggestions feature part of IntelliCode? No, the rename suggestions, it's part of GitHub Copilot features. So if you have Visual Studio and you install, I actually have a link here. So if you have Visual Studio and you install GitHub Copilot in there, then you'll get the rename suggestions feature, and you'll get the generate commit message feature and all the different features that I showed. The reason why it's that way is because for rename suggestions, we're using the LLM that GitHub Copilot fine-tuned to get the naming suggestions. So it's really tied into that LLM, and that's how we get those naming suggestions to Visual Studio. So yeah, there's a dependency. You'll have to install GitHub Copilot and into Visual Studio, have that subscription, and then you'll see it right there. And if you have any problems enabling it, please let me know. Other questions? Awesome. All right. Well, feel free to come up and ask me your specific questions. I'm really thankful that you came to an 8 o'clock talk, and thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your conference.